Bienvenidos a todos. Hola, Profe Wendy here, and today's lesson is going to be about las conversaciones, conversations in Spanish. Let's begin. Vamos. First, we'll be reviewing el vocabulario, vocabulary about the topic of saludos, which are greetings. The vocabulary on this slide will help you start a conversation in Spanish. First, we have two terms, hola and buenas. Both of these terms mean hello. Some people choose to use hola, whereas others choose to use buenas. They're both correct and can be used by anyone in any conversation in Spanish. Next, we have buenos dias, which means good morning. Just like in English, this phrase should only be used during daytime hours. Following this, we have buenas tardes, good afternoon. This phrase should only be used during the afternoon time. And lastly, we have buenas noches, good evening. This phrase should only be used during evening hours. Now, as we progress throughout the tutorial, it's really important that you are as actively engaged as possible. If you want to learn how to speak a language, you need to practice your pronunciation as often as possible. So on every vocabulary slide, after I explain the concepts, we'll go back to the top. I'll repeat each word or phrase 2 times, slowly, pausing in between, so that after I say each term, you can repeat it out loud to practice your pronunciation. If you want to practice additional times, please rewind the video and practice as much as you would like. Or if you make a mistake, simply rewind as well and fix up those mistakes before moving on. Let's give it a try. Hola. Hola. Buenas. Buenas. Here, before we move on, please note that the letter H, which in Spanish is called H, is a silent letter. Therefore, we write it down when writing, but we don't say it out loud. This is a silent letter. Buenos días. Buenos días. Buenas tardes. Buenas tardes. Buenas noches. Buenas noches. Now, before moving forward, I'd like to point something out on this slide that you may or may not have already noticed. First, some letters in Spanish will have accent marks. It's important to pay attention to these as you go because some accents affect pronunciation, some affect meaning, or it could affect both pronunciation and meaning. Therefore, as you learn these phrases, try to pay attention to where the written accent marks fall. Also, in addition to this, I want you to pay special attention to the letter O in the phrase buenos dias and the letter A in the phrases buenas tardes and buenas noches. Some beginners notice the difference here and say, is it okay if I switch it up? Can I put an A where there's an O or an O where there's an A? And the answer to that is no. Buenos dias must have the O, buenas tardes must have the A, and buenas noches must have the A. We're not going to get too far into the concept of gender in this video, but the reason behind the O and the A here deals with the concept of gender in the Spanish language, which we'll dedicate a whole tutorial to shortly after this one. So stay tuned. But for now, just pay attention to the fact that if you're saying good morning, you want buenos dias with the O. And if you're saying good afternoon or good evening, you want buenas tardes or buenas noches with the A. All right, let's continue. On the next slide, we'll talk about how to ask someone, how are you? Now, in English, we can do that by asking, how are you? What's new? What's going on? What's up? And in Spanish, we have similar options. But in Spanish, there is a level of formality that we need to pay attention to when speaking to someone else, because this can impact the phrases we choose to use in our conversations. So first, we have ¿cómo estás? Or ¿cómo estás tú? You're going to notice that the word tú is in parentheses. I'm trying to show you here that that word is optional. So you can include it in this question or you can omit it, and it's correct either way. Some people say ¿cómo estás? And others say ¿cómo estás tú? They're both correct. It's important to note, however, that this question is used informally. What do we mean by that? Well, you would use it when having an informal conversation with friends, with close family, etc. You would use it when speaking to anyone you feel comfortable speaking to in a more informal manner. On the other side, we have ¿cómo está? Or ¿cómo está usted? Which also means how are you? The meaning between these two questions is the same. The only difference is the formality level. So as we said, ¿cómo estás? Or ¿cómo estás tú? Is informal, whereas ¿cómo está? Or ¿cómo está usted? Is formal. Who would you use this with? Well, perhaps with strangers, with elders, with authority figures, etc. Anyone that you personally think that you would speak to in a little bit more of a formal manner. So, for example, if I was speaking to one of my students, I would use ¿cómo estás? Or ¿cómo estás tú? Because I would speak to a student in a more informal manner. Whereas if I was speaking to my boss, I would speak in a more formal manner. So I would say ¿cómo está? Or ¿cómo está usted? Another example could be my neighbor next door who's 5 years old. I would ask her, ¿cómo estás? Or ¿cómo estás tú? Whereas if I was speaking to her elderly grandmother, I would say, ¿cómo está? Or ¿cómo está usted? So as you navigate conversations in Spanish, just pay attention to who you're speaking to and whether you would speak to them in a more informal manner or a more formal manner when choosing between these two questions. There's also the question of ¿qué tal?, which means how are you as well, but interestingly, this one is neither formal nor informal, and therefore you can use it with anyone. All right, let's practice our pronunciation. Repeat after me. ¿Cómo estás? ¿Cómo estás? ¿Cómo estás tú? ¿Cómo estás tú? ¿Cómo está? ¿Cómo está? ¿Cómo está usted? ¿Cómo está usted? ¿Qué tal? ¿Qué tal? Remember that all three questions on this slide have the same meaning. ¿Cómo estás? ¿Cómo está? ¿Qué tal? They all mean how are you? Just remember that the first one is informal, the second one is formal, and the third one is neither formal nor informal, and therefore can be used with anyone. Before moving on, I'd like to point out something you may or may not have already noticed, which is the upside down question mark at the beginning of our questions. In Spanish, whenever you're writing, if you're writing a question, you must begin with an upside down question mark. If you're writing an exclamation in Spanish, you would begin with an upside down exclamation mark and a regular exclamation mark at the end. If you're writing a regular statement or sentence, you don't put anything in the front and simply put a regular period at the end. Oftentimes, people ask me why. Why is that? Well, Spanish grammar is just slightly different than English grammar, but it's definitely helpful because when you're reading something out loud in Spanish, you'll know from the beginning whether you have a question, a statement, or an exclamation. This helps you to know what to do with your voice. If you see an upside down question mark, you'll make your voice sound like a question. If you see an upside down exclamation mark, you'll make your voice sound like an exclamation. And if you see a period at the end, you know to just make your voice sound like a regular statement. All right, let's continue. Now, if someone in Spanish asks you, how are you? ¿Cómo estás? ¿Cómo está? ¿Qué tal? It's important to be able to respond to them and let them know how you're doing. So let's look at some ways that you can respond to someone in the Spanish language. First, we have the phrase yo estoy, which means I am. Following this, you can finish your phrase with an emotion word, an adjective from our list. Bien, which means well. Mal, which means bad. Así así, or más o menos, which both mean so-so. Alegre, or feliz, which means happy. Or triste, which means sad. So for example, anyone could say, yo estoy bien. Yo estoy mal. Yo estoy así así, o yo estoy más o menos. Yo estoy alegre. Yo estoy feliz. Yo estoy triste. All of the adjectives in this list are what we call gender neutral, meaning that male speakers and female speakers would all say these words the same. A male would say bien, a female would say bien. A male would say mal, a female would say mal, etc. In our next list, however, we are going to see a difference for male speakers versus female speakers. So let's take a look. We have contento or contenta for content. Nervioso or nerviosa for nervous. Enojado or enojada for angry. Confundido or confundida for confused. Tranquilo or tranquila for tranquil. Aburrido or aburrida for bored. Cansado or cansada for tired. Emocionado or emocionada for excited. Ocupado or ocupada for busy. Enfermo or enferma for sick. Sorprendido or sorprendida for surprised. And perdido or perdida for lost. Now, with all of the adjectives in this grouping, it depends upon your gender which adjective you'll use. If you're a male, you'll use the choice on the left-hand side ending in O. And if you're a female, you'll choose the choice on the right-hand side ending in A. Most words that end in O in Spanish are masculine words, whereas most words that end in A in Spanish are feminine words. So when choosing the correct adjective here, make sure if you're a male, you choose the O ending, and if you're a female, you choose the A ending. Let's practice our pronunciation. Yo estoy. Yo estoy. Bien. Bien. Mal. Mal. Así, así. Así, así. Más o menos. Más o menos. Alegre. Alegre. Feliz. Feliz. Triste. Triste. Now, for the next set, I am going to use the feminine option, but if you're a male, practice with the masculine option. Let's give it a try. Contenta. Contenta. Nerviosa. Nerviosa. Enojada. Enojada. Confundida. Confundida. Tranquila. Tranquila. Aburrida. Aburrida. Cansada. Cansada. Emocionada. Emocionada. Ocupada. Ocupada. Enferma. Enferma. Sorprendida. Sorprendida. Perdida. Perdida. Now, there's something important to point out on this slide. We started off with the phrase yo estoy, which means I am. Some Spanish speakers, however, will omit the word yo and simply say estoy. So, for example, you might hear someone say yo estoy bien, whereas someone else might simply say estoy bien. Both options are correct. If you're a beginner, I recommend keeping the yo because that is your subject, el sujeto. Estoy is your verb, el verbo, and bien, mal, enojado, confundido, any of these adjectives are your adjetivos. So when you're first learning a language, it's almost like putting a puzzle together piece by piece, and I want you to see the different pieces here. However, if you feel comfortable dropping it off, you can. Now, a lot of beginners say to me, well, how can we take this out? Because if I take out the word I, how can I start a sentence with the word am? am well, am bad, am content. That's not a full sentence. And the reason behind this is because in Spanish, if I omit the subject here, estoy is implying the subject. And the reason behind that is in Spanish, I can only use the verb estoy if I'm speaking about myself. So if I wanted to say you are well, or he is bad, or they are nervous, the verb would be completely different. So estoy implies yo because I have to be talking about myself if I use the verb estoy. So again, this is a bit more of an advanced skill that we'll talk about later on, but I just wanted to point it out in case you hear anyone simply saying estoy bien, that you're not confused. Well, where's the yo, right? The yo is optional, but as a beginner, I do suggest you leave it in. Now, before moving on from this slide, I would like to point out the cloud that I have over here on the side. And the cloud has two phrases in it that many people ask about. We have yo tengo hambre, I am hungry, and yo tengo sed, I am thirsty. Now, even though you are starting with I am, in Spanish, the grammar for these two phrases is different. We start with yo tengo instead of yo estoy. Now, technically, yo tengo means I have. So it's like you're saying, I have hunger, I have thirst, but we translate it to I am hungry and I am thirsty. But just be careful that you don't put estoy here because it should be tengo in both of these phrases. And again, you can omit the yo. So you might hear someone say tengo hambre or tengo sed. That is correct. Or you might hear people say yo tengo hambre, yo tengo sed. Also correct. Let's practice our pronunciation. Yo tengo hambre. Yo tengo hambre. Yo tengo sed. Yo tengo sed. All right, let's continue to the next slide. On this slide, we have two other questions you might hear from time to time. ¿Qué hay de nuevo? Which means what's new. This is neither formal nor informal, so it can be used with anyone. We also have ¿Qué pasa? Which is what's going on. Again, neither formal nor informal and can be used with anyone. Now, at this point in your language learning journey, it's difficult to respond to these questions in full sentences because you simply don't have enough vocabulary and grammar yet to do so. So for now, we'll respond by saying nothing, which is a pretty simple response, but it's a response you can use until you learn more vocabulary and grammar. But let's practice our pronunciation first. ¿Qué hay de nuevo? ¿Qué hay de nuevo? ¿Qué pasa? ¿Qué pasa? And here we have our beginner response of nada. And again, as I said, as you learn more, you'll be able to add more onto your answers. So before moving on, let's hear you say that. Nada. Nada. All right, now in English, think about a conversation. If someone asks you, how are you? And you reply, oh, I'm well, it's polite to ask them back. And you? How are you doing? So we want to learn how to do that in Spanish. You could say y tú, which means and you. This is the informal version that, again, you may use with friends, close family members, etc. And y usted also means and you, but this is the more formal version that you might use with strangers, elders, authority figures, etc. So again, y tú and y usted both mean and you. The meaning is exactly the same. The only difference is the formality. Y tú, you would use with someone you're comfortable speaking to in an informal manner, whereas y usted, you would use with someone you would rather speak to in a more formal manner. Let's practice that pronunciation. ¿Y tú? ¿Y tú? ¿Y usted? ¿Y usted? All right, now we're on to farewells, despedidas. We have adios and ciao. Both of these mean goodbye. Many people think ciao is strictly used in the Italian language, but it is used from time to time in Spanish. So again, you can use adios or you can use ciao. They both mean goodbye and they're both acceptable. We have hasta luego, see you later. Hasta pronto, see you soon. Hasta mañana, see you tomorrow. And nos vemos, which means we will see each other, or more informally, see ya. Now, oftentimes beginners have trouble remembering the difference between hasta luego and hasta pronto. They have trouble saying, oh, which one's later, which one's soon. What I always teach my students is luego has an L, and so does later. So just try to remember in your head LL, later, luego, later, luego. That way you know that that one for sure is see you later, and then therefore hasta pronto would be see you soon. Let's practice our pronunciation of these phrases. Adios. Adios. Ciao. Ciao. Hasta luego. Hasta luego. Remember, H's are silent, so it's not hasta luego, it's hasta. Hasta luego. Hasta pronto. Hasta pronto. Hasta mañana. Hasta mañana. Nos vemos. Nos vemos. And lastly, on this slide, we have two phrases that you might want to use, especially when speaking to someone for the first time. We have mucho gusto, which means nice to meet you. And we also have encantado or encantada, which both mean nice to meet you. The only difference is the gender. Encantado is the masculine version, whereas encantada is the feminine version. But just like in English, if you're speaking to someone for the first time, it's polite for you to say nice to meet you. So again, you can use mucho gusto or the proper version of encantado or encantada, depending upon gender. Encantado is masculine and encantada is feminine. Let's practice our pronunciation. Mucho gusto. Mucho gusto. Encantado. Encantado. Encantada. Encantada. All right, everybody, this brings us to the end of our first tutorial on las conversaciones, on conversation skills. Just a few things I'd like to mention at this point. First, I'm proud of you. Great job. Learning a language is an amazing experience that sometimes can feel a bit daunting, but I want you to know that I am here supporting you every step of the way. I recommend that you watch my tutorials in order, but you take time to practice each one. I wouldn't say to watch 1, then 2, then 3, then 4. I would say watch 1 a few times during your first week. I'll also have a second video after this one that will help you practice these skills. Stay on that until you feel comfortable. Then move on to tutorial number 2. Practice that till you feel comfortable. Then move on to tutorial number 3. And as you go, you'll see, wow, I'm gaining confidence and I'm really understanding these skills, and it's helping you speak to others in Spanish, which is our goal. I would greatly appreciate it if you could please like this video, subscribe to my channel, and leave comments below, especially if you have questions. I'm more than happy to answer your questions to help you learn throughout this process. Gracias. Thank you, everyone, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video that will be dedicated to practicing these skills. But for now, hasta luego. Adios.